Alright, 1800s imperialism. The definition of imperialism, according to the Merriam-Webster Dictionary, defines imperialism as the policy, practice, or advocacy of extending the power and dominion of a nation, especially by direct territorial acquisitions or by gaining indirect control over the political or economic life of other areas. Broadly, the extension or imposition of power, authority, or influence. The three main methods of imperialism were through political, cultural, and economic means. The reasons countries in the late 19th century imperialized were the need for raw resources to fuel the Industrial Revolution, to have strategic ports and bases around the world to protect this trade, to boost a nation's confidence and the principle of nationalism, to civilize the world, and to spread Christianity, also known as the white man's burden, and because it was relatively easy for an advanced nation to imperialize a weak one. Civilizing the world was often the humanitarian reasoning that a country would use to mask the fact that it was killing the population with disease and stealing its resources. Economically, colonies were very viable because raw resources could be easily taken or bought for literally nothing, then refined at home or even in the country taken from, and sold thereafter for massive profit. In the case of the later, wages were also next to nothing if native workers were hired to get their own resources out. They were paid almost nothing. To keep up means if one country imperializes and benefits from it and your country has not imperialized, your country will become behind. Similar logic behind cheating. If one kid cheats and gets an A, others feel pressured to cheat and also try and get an A. After the age of exploration means Europe eventually gets done settling its own borders and stabilizing their own countries enough so that they are able to influence other countries and to benefit themselves from this exploration. Although Vikings were the first to reach America, they did not write about it, and their tales are largely unknown and only told through speech. It is only with the expeditions by Spain and Portugal that are recorded that new lands are discovered. Africa really wasn't part of imperialism yet because it was only skimmed for slaves on the coast, and most Europeans did not venture in until the late 19th century. India and China are set up with trade routes to get products from there that can't be obtained in Europe. So, went to get some water there. Where was I? Yes, India and China. Trade routes are set up there to get resources from that country to bring back to Europe. However, Europe is not yet selling its resources to other countries, so it's not true imperialism. The same goes true at first with North and South America. The major imperialists in the late 19th century were Britain, Germany, France, and Belgium. Why not Russia or Austria-Hungary, other European powerhouses? Mainly because these powerhouses were comprised of so much land and different ethnicities that they couldn't actually control their own internal affairs well enough to control the internal affairs of other countries, so they mainly focused on their own. Other European powers such as Sweden and Portugal and Spain then, were currently in an economic downturn or had recently been dominated by other European powers and therefore didn't imperialize. Britain set the model for imperializing by establishing themselves politically, economically, and culturally. In their peak, they held 1/4 of the world's landmass and 1/4 of the world's population, either indirectly or directly. And they held territory in all the continents, besides Antarctica. They didn't get land in that until later. India was the crown jewel of British colonies, mainly because it was the longest colonial power it was the longest colony under the influence of British policy. First through the East India Trading Company, a private company. Later, when the private company lost control of the country, the British government directly controlled the country. In China, at first China was a self-sufficient government, believing only to export, never to import. This was the policy of mercantilism. Other nations continually kept trying to access the great masses of people in China to sell their products to, but it was very slow at first until, after tough negotiations and show of military forces, threats of war, and actual war caused by the illegal trade of opium, China became opened up and was forced into trading agreements with other countries. Both of these, China was actually lost in the transition from World War I to World War II as a British colony, that is, and India was decolonized after World War II because Britain could no longer maintain its colonies with its own country in shambles. Britain was mainly in southern Africa, Egypt, and other small sections of Africa broken up by other European powers. Egypt was important to the British because it had at one time been a French colony, but the British had fought with the other European power and taken it over. It contained the Suez Canal, a valuable trade route from the Mediterranean to the Indian Ocean. In Rhodesia, also known as Southern Africa, Zimbabwe now, there were diamond mines that one businessman, Cecil Rhodes, eventually bought up the majority of the diamond mines in southern Africa and had the country named after him, Rhodesia. In all of the African lands, the British governed them all directly. They gave very little or no political rights to the Africans to do any of their own local self-government. And if the Africans tried to resist, the resistances were brutally put down. As in the case in Nigeria in 1918, an Egba riot took place. 20,000 Egba took to the streets. Over 1,000 of them were gunned down by British soldiers. France is the third most powerful country in Europe in terms of industrial output and military size. It is the second most powerful colonial power, though. It is primarily located in northern Africa and Vietnam, or Indochina. According to Jules Ferry, this also gave some knowledge why to imperialize at the time. Sheltered overseas markets would solve the problem of low prices and shrinking consumers in Europe. In the scramble for Africa, France sent advance teams quickly to West Africa and ended up taking the majority of the land, especially throughout the Sahara, where the French Foreign Legion was set up. And they took as much land as they could, but they avoided other European powers, avoided attempting to fight with them. France had no intention of fighting. In the lands they took, they not only took the resources, but they also grew their own crops, meant to refine into products and sell to other more advanced nations. This often dismayed the locals, as they were growing large plantations of cotton while the locals struggled to survive. Political rights were given to West Africa in 1946 after World War II, as the French could no longer maintain their colony. France in Indochina, or else otherwise known as Vietnam, it started with the religious groups that went there to try and convert the population to Christianity. When these religious groups were persecuted, the French army moved in to protect them, and actually ended up fighting several wars with the local peoples, and eventually controlled all of Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. The French used fairly ruthless tactics to control these countries, and rebellions were constantly popping up. However, none of them had enough centrality and power to remain very long before being crushed by the French. During World War II, as the French were being dominated by the Germans, Japan actually came in and took control of Indochina in their own expansionist policies. However, during the Japanese rule, a strong rebellion formed, and the Japanese were having difficulty maintaining control of the country and actually almost lost it. However, the war ended before the Indochina Vietnamese people could actually claim independence, and the French, after being saved by America, Russia, and Britain, actually returned to Indochina to keep controlling it. However, the new rebellion group was much stronger than before, and France couldn't handle it. After North Vietnam went communist, they gave up and left. After the communism, however, the United States moved in to attempt and solve the situation. Germany was the second most powerful country in Europe at the time, third strongest colonial, only having small sections in Lower Africa and a handful of Pacific islands. The reason is Germany got in late. They had only recently become a country, and by the time they started colonizing, there were very few places left to colonize where they wouldn't be in conflict with other European powers, and the places they did colonize, the natives were often much more hostile, which Germany responded to this by being even more hostile, often treating the natives incredibly harshly, exterminating the population of several native areas, including the Hiro and Nama, but this was short-lived, as after World War I, their colonies were quickly taken and lost and never returned. Belgium and the Congo. Belgium is a tiny country located in between France and Germany that has a very high industry for such a small country. Eventually, they started colonizing. They only colonized primarily the Congo, ironically calling it the Free State of the Congo, for all European powers to use. Mainly Belgium controlled it, however, and they treated the natives very, very harshly. The colony was like the king's private fief, much of the profits from it going directly into the king's private account. The people there were treated as slaves in their own country, and often just butchered for minor things. The horrors of the Congo were eventually publicized and brought infamy to Belgium, who eventually had to reverse its policies and be a little bit nicer. The consequences of imperialism, well, the positive at least, it jump-started Europe. Europe became way ahead of the rest. Europe had always been slightly ahead of the world, but now, all of a sudden, Europe was at the forefront of everything. Europe claimed to have supposedly brought culture and civilization to the areas it colonized. The mortality rates went down, literacy rates went up in some countries, truthfully. Infrastructure was left behind in some African countries that they continued to use so that they had some industry built up for them, and they still had trade agreements with some European countries giving them some international ties. However, Africa was also set up for extreme failure. When the governments left, oftentimes they basically fled. Their people basically fled, and all of a sudden the country had no one ruling it, but some of the people stood up and decided that they wanted to rule. However, these people that stood up and decided to rule were often not fair in their rule, and even when they were, colonial governments, even though they were no longer directly involved in the country, would actually supply arms and put in power a group of people that would give the colonial powers a favorable trade deal. So always there was this struggle to who's in power, and therefore nothing could ever get done in the country, and often living conditions were awful, and it was just a bad situation. Racism is also set up in Africa, Africans versus Africans. Belgium, for example, picked citizens which were better and gave them higher positions just based on how they looked. They looked better to them. This causes hate to ensue among the rest of the Belgians towards these people, which causes mass killing and very, very nasty things. Some native populations, like the Hiro and Nama, lose 75% to 50% of their actual population due to military conquest. Others lose staggering amounts of people to disease. Some African culture is forever lost due to European involvement. And Europe also stripped the country of resources it could have used for its own benefit when it became a legitimate trading power with the rest of the world, meaning now it has less to trade. Overall, it advanced countries that just weren't ready for it.